Okay, we're calling to order the July 9th, 2009 meeting of the Municipality of Anchorage Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals. We have with us tonight a new recorder and clerk, Jill Graves, so welcome. I told her ahead of time that we would, since we're all learning kind of a new system tonight and she's new to us, that she's free to interrupt us if we speak too fast or we've done something that she didn't get on the record. So be prepared for anything like that as we get used to each other. And with that, she's going to call the roll.
Daniel Freitas, and do correct me if I get your names wrong and give me
Freitas.
Freitas, thank you. Dean Kars, Holly Sozo, Jeff Ron,
Here.
Joanna Croft,
Here.
Kenneth Burkhart,
Here.
Mike Marsh, Thomas Van Flyne,
Here?
Timothy Bigg,
Here.
Okay. All right. I assume everyone has had a chance to review the minutes from the last meeting. Are there any changes, corrections, modifications, anything of that nature regarding the minutes? Looking left, looking right. With that,
I need to finish the
Oh.
roll call. Give me one
Oh, I'm
second.
sorry.
I've got to enter it into the system or you won't vote right. I'll say, so, she's out. Marsh is out.
Ken Burkhart.
Yes. Okay, let's record this. Go. No? Okay, I thought I had it right. Okay, back to the minutes. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
okay. Is there any objection to adopting the minutes as set forth in the draft as the official minutes for the June 11, 2009 meeting? Seeing none, they are adopted. That then brings us to whether anyone has any disclosures to make regarding any matter that may be in front of us tonight. Seeing none, we'll go on to... Yes, I'm sorry.
In the matter of case 2009-095, the third item on our new business this evening, the petitioner is to be represented by Mike Anderson, who was a representative for a client that I'd had in the past, and I think our work has been finished for some time. I don't know of any ongoing work with Mr. Anderson, but I don't see a reason that I couldn't be impartial on this case.
Okay. Are there any board members who would like to question Mr. Bigg on that? Seeing none, thank you, sir. Okay, that brings us to the consent agenda. Taking a look now at the resolution 2009-013, the drafts. I'm sorry? We do, I guess. Okay. We can do them all cumulative, I guess, rather than separately. So, do I have a motion regarding the consent agenda to approve them? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I'd like to remove 2009-014 and 2009-015 from.
Okay, I'm being informed we need a motion to approve all of it and then a request to remove.
So I need we got a mover, just need a second.
And if we don't get it, we can't go on to the rest of the stuff.
Okay.
How about this? I will move for...
That's the motion on the floor.
oh, it is on the floor. Okay.
So we've got a mover and a seconder, and
Okay.
now you just have to list what you'd like to have removed from the consent agenda, and then once we remove
Got
the
it.
items, we approve.
Okay,
on the
I see now here on the screen, Mr. Bigg has moved. It's been seconded by Ms. Croft. Thank you. And Mr. Burkhart, you had a request.
Yes, I'd like to remove resolutions 2009-014 and 2009-015. I think both of them need some substantial corrections.
Do you want to elaborate on the corrections at all?
On 2009-014, that's the case we had a month or two back that dealt with a landscaping issue for a daycare, and all the findings of fact are related to a dwelling and don't belong with this case.
Okay, got it. So should we just take the vote first?
Vote the
Whether
motion, and then we'll work on each resolution that was removed, and you'll have a motion for each resolution.
Okay, I didn't know if he needed to explain why he wanted some moved before we voted on it.
I don't think
Okay.
necessarily it has to be that complicated.
Okay. Is there any objection to removing the two items identified by Mr. Burkhart for separate discussion? None?
We'll do over. Okay, for the unanimous vote. Okay. And now we move on to the first resolution, number 2009-014. I believe you wanted, let's see,
13, you mean?
13? Okay.
Okay, the one that was separated out, you mean? Okay, Mr. Burkhart, do you want to address 2009-13?
No, I don't have any difficulty with 2009-013. It was 014 and 015.
Okay, I meant 14, sorry.
Yes, Resolution 2009-014 had to do with buffer landscaping and a daycare, and all the findings of fact are in relation to a residence, another case, and so I think that needs to be rewritten. And likewise, in Resolution 2009-015, that was related to a house in Nunaka Valley, and I think everything in terms of the board's findings of fact are from another case that we had that was in the Spinard area on another case. So likewise, I think that all the findings of fact don't belong to that case.
Any comment to Mr. Burkhart's motion and suggestions here to send it back?
Because his memory serves me well.
Okay. Mr. Burkhart, are you moving to reject these draft resolutions and send it back to staff for correction?
Yes, please.
Okay. Is there further discussion regarding Mr. Burkhart's motion? Okay. Does it need a formal affirmative vote?
Right. If they could use their, make the motion, use it back. Thank you.
Okay.
The motion button.
And now a second.
There we go. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Anything additional you want to address on your motions, Mr. Burkhart?
No.
Mr. Ron?
No.
Okay, we're ready to vote.
I have a question. So the motion is to approve, and is the motion to approve, or is the motion to approve rejecting?
Oh, that's my fault. I don't have the right selection on that motion. Give me 1 second to, let's see if I can,
I thought the motion was to send it back to the staff for rewrite.
there we go.
I guess I just wanted to be clear on.
Motion to remand.
Yes.
There we go. We got it. Did it update on your screen?
Not on mine. Is there a refresh?
Don't know.
Should I withdraw my vote and redo it?
It should. I saved it, but I think we're going to have to check into it, but it is recorded as a remand. So if you don't mind going ahead and voting, I'll make sure it's correct in the minutes.
I've got a message on my screen that I'm marked as being absent.
Oh, do I? That won't work. Dean is the one who's absent. Yeah. So Dean and Holly Sozo, and who's the third? And Holly.
I have been accused of being absent from time to time, but not in this particular case.
Okay.
Blame it on this new system.
Thanks. Yes.
The software's from Tehran.
Okay. I'll do that. I met with her, and oh, my neck. Okay.
Oh, it should be three.
There we go. Okay.
Okay,
Be good to go.
and we're moving on. Okay, it's been approved unanimously. Let's see, next, are there any appearance requests?
No, sir.
Thank you. I don't have on our agenda any unfinished business, but I shall ask, is there any unfinished business that may not be on my agenda here that we should bring up?
No, sir.
Okay. That brings us to the regular agenda, of which there's nothing listed. And then I guess we go to Subpart H, the public hearings. Correct?
Correct.
All right. We're moving right along here. We're halfway through this agenda. The first matter before us is case number 2008-064. The petitioner is Suzanne L. Baird. And this is a reconsideration. I do have a note here that staff, through Ms. Auteur, has a comment.
Mr. Chairman, briefly, the history on this is that the board held a public hearing in April of 2008 for the subject variance, which is an encroachment into a front yard setback in the R2M district. At the time, the board voted unanimously to deny the request. There followed a notice of reconsideration that was spread by Mr. Burkhart in the following month, and the board agreed to postpone the action on the reconsideration to June because Mr. Burkhart was absent. At the June meeting, the board took up the notification for reconsideration, and Mr. Burkhart put forward the fact that the petitioner did not understand that they had an opportunity to have asked for a lesser variance before the board, and therefore, because they weren't aware of it, that they should be allowed to come back with another request. So the board interpreted the rationale as a procedural error. What followed between the June meeting in 2008 and this evening was that there were a series of contacts made to the petitioner, both in writing and by telephone, advising her that what the board was offering her was an opportunity to come in with a lesser request, and that she needed to make that application. There followed a series of postponements that essentially bring us to where we are this evening. And at the time that I wrote this memorandum, the petitioner and I had been trading telephone calls, and she had not submitted anything at the time I'd written this. However, since that time, since the time that this was written, and before we sent this out in your packet, I asked her to provide a letter. So if you look at the supplemental agenda or comments received after the staff report was written, you will find her letter that we received on June 30th, in which she essentially summarizes her lesser variance request. However, what I advised her to do, because the minutes don't reflect that the board took action, there were actually two parts to the variance request, and it's on the front page of the memorandum that you have before you tonight. She was requesting that the house overhang encroaches 0.3 feet. That is a request the board does need to take an action on. And then secondly, that she originally had requested that a newly reconstructed deck be allowed to encroach 10.3 feet. That is what you actually denied a year ago. What she's coming forward to this evening is a request for a 4.3-foot encroachment of the deck. And as she will explain, that is the dimension of the deck at the time that she bought the house, and that through her research has been there for many years. I don't know the date that encroachment existed, but it was, she had expanded that deck an additional 6 feet, and that is what the board did not find approvable. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would request that you hear from the petitioner and take into consideration her lesser request. The department could accept both of those variances, although we've not had an opportunity to formally go through the 7 standards.
Okay. Before hearing from the petitioner, I'd like to see if any member of the board has questions for staff. Yes, Mr. Burkhart.
I guess is our order of business in this reconsideration the same as for any variance?
Through the chair, Mr. Burkhart, actually where you're at this evening is a de novo hearing. That you actually voted to reconsider at the June 2008 meeting. So tonight actually is the public hearing on a lesser variance. Now, we did advertise exactly as it appears on the subject. So you can go forward.
Okay. I guess then, Mr. Chairman, I guess I would suggest that you go over the procedure of the case, and as we usually do, to advise all the petitioners on their speaking periods and public hearing and such.
Okay.
And I've got that marked in my book if you'd like
Let me
to.
have it. I don't have the cheat sheet with me. What Mr. Burkhart is referring to is there's a process we'll follow, a public process here, and I'll just outline it so everyone has notice of how it works. Anyone who wants to testify in this matter can do so. They come forward, and they're allotted 3 minutes. The first that will happen is the staff will make a presentation. You already heard part of that. Then the petitioner or appellant is allowed to come forward and state their case as well. After that, the staff can provide a rebuttal to what has been provided and what has been heard. All testimony will be on the record and will be public. People who offer testimony may sometimes be questioned by the board for follow-up information and clarification. And at some point then, when there's no further testimony, we close the public testimony. The board then deliberates in public on it and takes a vote and discusses the applicable statutory factors, weighing the evidence, and in light of the factors and the totality of circumstances that we're obligated to look at, and the matter is either approved or disapproved. What we haven't had, I guess, we usually start with a more formal, I had the note to get the updated information from staff. What I don't have is any kind of a more formal presentation from Ms. Autor, so I didn't mean to cut you off.
Mr. Chairman, as I explained, we did not have an opportunity to do that. her request came in as the day of the packet being routed to you. The board has the opportunity to take her new request and consider the evaluation. Now, I do believe, Mr. Chairman, that she has presented information in her packet that does suggest that the previous deck, before she added the 6 feet to it, had existed for a number of years in harmony with the neighborhood, and that it did not create or cause any complaint being made to the municipality. So it was a matter of bringing, what she's requesting is to bring it back to what it was. And the fact that I believe there is I forget what the use is on the south side of the property, or across the street, but it is not residential. And so it is not impactive to residents on the south side of the property. And that's about all I can comment on at this point. So it would be the minimum variance to make use of the property, in addition to which she is adding a set of stairs, because this is there are sliding doors to this deck that are needed for a secondary fire access.
Okay. Any questions for staff? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Artur, just to reiterate, did you state that the department would be okay with the variances?
Yes, we would.
Okay. So, Mr. Chair, a question for you and the board, I guess, then. I wasn't here for the original case. That was beyond my tenure. It seems that it may be prudent for us as a board to evaluate all 7 standards based on the information that was issued after staff report time period concluded, as well as the public comment and petitioners' period to speak as well.
I certainly think that's appropriate from a procedural perspective, that we have that on the record. Since this is a hearing de novo, I think it needs to be on the record, and particularly since there may be other members as well who didn't participate in the first hearing. So with that, I think staff is addressed several of them. Certainly factor number 4 was certainly just recently addressed. Ms. O'Toole, would you want to address all 7? Are you prepared to do so tonight?
No, sir, I'm not.
Would you prefer that we move this to the next meeting, so that, even though I understand the staff is not having any objections to the reduced request or the more limited request, do you think it's necessary for us to postpone this so you have a more complete presentation?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's a matter for the board to make a determination on. And primarily the reason I make that statement is that beyond the June 12, 2008, you will have gone beyond a year, and technically speaking, it would have to be a brand new variance request and an application and a fee. And this was the first meeting that was available closest to that June 12 date. So we were trying to keep it within that year. Otherwise, if the board does not act tonight, then she has to resubmit and go through another process.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Freitas?
Yes. I guess I would like to ask first, is the petitioner here, and maybe see if the petitioner can address all 7 standards, and if not, then maybe we should decide on whether or not we should hear it.
Okay. I think we can do that, particularly since staff said they're done, so normally we would move to the petitioner's comments at this point anyway. So if the petitioner is here, please come forward and state your name for the record.
Suzanne Baird. I might add, you guys need to speak up. You can't hear you back there.
All right, sorry about that. And you have 10 minutes to talk to us and tell us about your reconsideration and why you think it should be granted.
Well, I'll try to be as brief as I can. I did not plan on representing all 7 standards. So let me just get my paperwork here. Let's see. The first standard was the exceptional extraordinary physical circumstances, and the main issue here is that the house, when it was originally constructed, was set back only 6 feet from the city setback that exists now. And there's no place to go back behind the property. There's a 10-foot easement that the city has, and there's standing water there. And this past summer or winter, when it melted away, my motorhome sunk 2 feet down into the ground and had to have it towed out. So there's no place for me to use the rear of my property. The east side of my property only has 15 feet, and so there's no place to put a deck or a door to exit the property. The other side would take up parking space away that I'm required to have because I have a duplex. So that's the item number 1. Item number 2, the permitted overhang that was constructed in 1988 and 89 was built by owners, two ownerships ago, I guess. And they said, I spoke to them personally, that they did include the 4-foot deck that was included in that overhang. It was constructed with beams that were constructed by my neighbor. And so that's always been there. When I purchased the home, I didn't realize that it had not been properly permitted, if that is in case the fact. They said they can't find the paperwork on that. So it's basically my challenge to prove that, but I feel that I've proven that by talking to the people that owned it and the people that surrounded the property at the time as far as neighborhoods go. Item number 3, the hardship is not self-imposed. The 10-foot 3 deck, yes, I guess I imposed that on myself because I was not aware that I was already in the city setback with the 4-foot original deck. When the deck rotted and I replaced it, I was unaware that I needed a permit to replace an existing deck, and I didn't realize I was in the city setback. So I guess I did self-impose that partially, but I felt that it was an enhancement to the neighborhood and an enhancement to my home. Item number 4, does it affect the adjacent properties? Not at all. My neighbors have been very supportive. The Spenard City Council has unanimously, voted to keep it and request it in writing to the Zoning and Planning Board. Will it change the character of the zoning district? No. All the houses in between 45th and 48th Avenue, all but with the exception of maybe 4, have decks, mostly in the front, for usage for entertainment and egress. So mine having this deck would not be anything adverse to the adjacent properties, and it would not change the character of the zoning district. Effects of the variance adversely. No, I don't think it affects it at all. As a matter of fact, I think according to my neighbors and everyone else, it's kind of a safety factor because I'm right across from the Spenard Rec Center. I can see everything that goes on up and down the street. So it's kind of important. And speaking with the police that are a part of the Spenard City Council Safety Committee, he thinks it's a great idea to have it there because I can see everything and call if there's a problem to a special hotline. Number 7, if granted, what is the minimum variance used to make use of the land? I believe that, as Ms. Auteur said, that the 4-foot original deck that was on the property is the most likely minimum variance I could have in order to have a secondary egress out of my home. And when we had the original hearing, it was actually brought up by one of the board members, I'm sorry, I think it was Mr. Burkhart that may have mentioned it, that he asked if I had how my egress was, and I told him, well, I can jump off the deck, and he said, well, nobody else can jump off the deck. So it's clear to me that I do need a secondary egress, and this would be the only way to get out of the home without reconstructing one side of my property, which still wouldn't be within the allowable amount of space I have to work with. So that's all.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions for the petitioner from our board members? I'm looking up my screen here. Is any? Oh, yes, I have two now. Ms. Croft, you go first.
Nice to see you again, Ms. Baird.
Hello.
The question is, could you please state so everyone on the board understands what variance you are requesting? As Ms. O'Toole said, there are two portions of it, and I think we need to be clear about what those two portions, what they are.
Certainly. The first variance is that the overhang that was constructed and permitted by the city in 1988 and 89 has a 0.3 encroachment on the east side of the house. And so I'm requesting an administrative variance for that because it was already done prior with the permit. So that's item number one.
Excuse me, what is the overhang of what? Is the
overhang that was constructed by permit that was granted by the city.
But the overhang of the deck, then?
No, the overhang period. Not the deck, just the overhang. There was a 6-foot deck. If you will look at page, page 7 of the comments received after the staff report was written. It says front view from 38th Avenue, view from across the street. If you look at the front view from the 38th Avenue, there's a deck, but behind that, between the gutter on the left side of the picture to the front, minus the deck, that's the overhang that was constructed by permit. And the east side of the property has a 0.3 encroachment.
Thank you.
So I'm requesting for that to be approved. And then the secondary variance is that the 10.3-foot deck that I have right now, I would like to reduce that back to the original construction, which is on that same photograph, of 4 feet, but I would like to put a stairway that comes down even to the front of the deck, down backwards to the lower deck so that I have a method of getting out of the property, or more importantly, somebody else can get out of it since I can jump. So those are my two requests.
Okay, and then a follow-up. As you were addressing the standards, you referred to the other portions of the property that you felt you couldn't, there was no good alternative to having the deck on the front of the building. So you're saying on one side we have the driveway, so we can see that's on the west side, and on the east side, that was the setback that you weren't, the easement that you couldn't.
Correct, but there are also no windows on that side, and there is plumbing, and I think there's I've only got 15 feet on that side, so I really don't have any place to go out more than without creating a whole new reconstructed side of my home, which I don't feel I should have to do since it wasn't required before.
And the rear of the property was, that standing water, is that related to the peat issue?
Yes.
That was discussed before? Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Mr. Vig has some questions.
I think the petitioner answered the question that I had, which was exactly what variance she was requesting. I understand now. Thank you.
I have a request from Ms. Autour.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I think to be clear, what the first variance is a second floor cantilever encroachment of the dwelling itself, because that is what was expanded onto the original house. So that is what the 0.3-foot encroachment is. The second variance, you have to add that 0.3 into the deck request. Otherwise, it would still not come out right on the southwest corner. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Ron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to clarify, Ms. Alter, the 0.3 feet is for the living space encroachment as opposed to the roof overhang.
That's correct.
Mr. Chair, if I could ask the petitioner a question as well.
Absolutely.
Ms. Baird, trying to understand the timeline of previous events. Can you walk me through? I understand you testified in April and the variance was denied. Was the deck under construction at that point in time, and what occurred?
No, it was already completed. What occurred is that between December of 07 and January of 08, well, let me see. I started construction on the property in 07, and they finished it last year. Actually, I guess it was 06. Anyway, they worked on. I had an addition done that was permitted, and at the time when my architect worked on my plans, we used the as-built that the only one I had, which was the one I had when I purchased the property originally, and that turned out to be an inaccurate as-built because the people who had lived there in 1988 had obtained a permit, of which the 6-foot overhang was done along with a 4-foot deck, and when they closed the permit out, they never required a new as-built for the property. So when I purchased it, I did not realize that the as-built I had was not accurate. It showed my old fence that was there, the same deck, and if you go back and look at the pictures from 1972, 1976, 1980, the front of the house looks exactly the same. All they did was keep moving it forward and move the patio door and the window out of the old construction into the new construction. So it's the exact same face, just closer to the street. And I think that's where many people have looked at this and they're not seeing that it's the same property, they just moved it out and they included the deck. So when I went to, or my general contractor went to get my certificate of occupancy for my addition that went to the rear of my property, they said, "Where's your new as-built?" So we went and ordered one, thinking everything's fine, and they said, "You have an encroachment problem," and hence the project began. And that's why, if you go through, that happened on January 30th, 2008, and that's when I got involved with planning and had a letter done in February of 08 that outlines the progression of the property from start to present, or to the present time at that point in this process.
Has there been any elevation change in that deck, or did you just extend out?
I just extended out. And that was because the railing rotted off when the people constructed it in 1988. They didn't really use the proper kind of wood, and it pulled away from the house. So other than raising the handrail up about 2 inches so that I could anchor into it or have my contractor anchor into it, that was the only, we just extended it out and put more support on it underneath it.
Thank you.
Any further questions for the petitioner from any board member? Seeing none, I believe the staff can address any new information or rebuttal.
I have no rebuttal, sir.
Yes, Mr. Burkhardt.
I do have a question for staff that if I go to page 1 of the original packet that's dated April 10th, 2008, and so if we want to summarize the changes to the request here, if we take out the word newly before reconstructed deck and add in the words and new stair after the words reconstructed deck, and change the 10.3 feet to 4.3 feet, would that
Correct.
get us to where we need to be?
That would get us there.
Okay. And then in the department recommendations, under condition number 3, if we once again change that to reconstructed deck and new stair, and change the 10.3 feet to 4.3 feet, we'd be,
That would do it.
okay, thank you.
Did my homework, I'll let you do it now.
Any other questions or comments for staff from a board member? Mr. Freitas? No. Ms. Croft, did you just press your button? No? How do I clear this? Okay. I think then we're ready to take public testimony on this. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
At this time, if there's anybody who would like to speak to us and provide information to us regarding the petition, either in favor or against it, come forward. Please state your name, sir.
Mr. Chairman of the board, I'm Alan Thornhill. I live next door to her. I've seen other construction projects since its beginning. I'm also an officer of Sparrow Community Council, which she came over with the variance, and we did not have a problem. And also, as far as her properties, on the setback, the easements, we will not have a sidewalk going in there because the sidewalk is on the other side of the street where it should be with the kids. On the side of Sparrow Rec Center. So we have no problems as far as me being next door with a deck, and the deck has been put on since the beginning, whenever the house was reestablished.
Okay. Are there any questions from the board? Yes, Mr. Freitas.
Yes, sir, Mr. Thornhill. You speaking for yourself personally and also as a member of the Sparrow Community Council?
As an officer of the council.
Thank you. I want to clarify that.
For about 17 years.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir. Are there any other members of the public who would like to come forward to discuss this petition or reconsideration? Okay, seeing none, the public testimony is now concluded. And that now leaves us with the responsibility of accepting a motion, so this can be discussed on the merit. Is there a member of the board who would like to make a motion and stating it in the affirmative? I see that Mr. Burkhart has. You've got the floor.
In case 2008-064, I move we grant a variance from AMC 21.40.045.G1 minimum yard requirements to allow a house addition overhang to encroach 0.3 feet and a reconstructed deck and new stair to encroach 4.3 feet into the required 20-foot front yard setback for the R2M multifamily residential zoning district, subject to conditions 1, 2, and 3 on page 9 of the packet, and amending condition number 3 to read the variance from AMC 21.40.045 G1 allows a reconstructed deck and new stair to encroach 4.3 feet into the required 20-foot front yard setback.
Okay. And Mr. Freitas?
Yes, I agree with Mr. Burkhart on that motion. I would like to just point out I do recall the case quite well. I sat in on that, and that the board had made the recommendation for the reconsideration, and it appears that Mrs. Beard has followed that recommendation to the letter, and I intend to support it.
Okay. So that was the second. And Mr. Burkhart, would you like to address the factors we ought to be considering regarding your motion?
Yes. As far as standard number 1 is concerned, I think that's met, that if we look on page 2 of the packet that the zoning in this area is a little bit unusual in that we're talking about an R2M zoning district that's only one lot deep, backs up to R1, and directly across from the property is a PLI district and an I1 district down the street. That although this lot is rectangular and shares this configuration with some of the adjacent properties, when you look at the total number of properties in the area, I think this is somewhat unusual. And in that vein, I think that standard number 1 is met. Standard number 2, I think, is met. That strict application of the code would create an exceptional or undue hardship. I think the exceptional or undue hardship in this case partly springs from that deck being existing. I think the configuration of the home and secondary means of egress, I think, is an important issue. So I think in some respects that standard 2 is at least partially met. I think standard number 3, I think the intent of that is met, that even though this action was brought about by enlarging the deck, that the deck itself pre-existed the ownership of the property owner, and she's willing to decrease the size of the deck back to what was originally there. And I think in that case, standard 3 is at least partially met. I think standard 4 is clearly met. They appreciate the testimony of the officer from Spenard Community Council that I think there is not any adverse effect to the use of adjacent property. Standard 5 is met, that that it will not permit a use otherwise than is permitted in the district. I think standard 6 is met. Once again, the testimony from the officer of the Spenard Community Council. And I think standard 7 is met, as I think this taking the size of the deck back to its original size, I think, is a minimum variance that would make possible a reasonable use of the land. Entirely taking off that deck, I think, would look very odd in terms of the windows and character, residential character of that side of the street. So I support the variance request.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Freitas, you already spoke somewhat on your factual feelings about the case or your assessment of the case. Would you like to speak further onto it?
Yes, please. Would like to add that on standard number 6, not only is it not affecting the health and safety of others in the neighborhood, but as I understand it, it's also going to increase the health and safety because she'll be adding the stairs for a proper fire exit for that building, so we'll actually be enhancing it.
I'm sorry.
Yes. Not picking it up.
Are there any other board members who would like to address the pending motion? Then at this time, I think we can proceed with a vote. Please vote. It appears that the reconsideration has passed unanimously. Staff will prepare the revised scope as Mr. Burkhart has laid it out in his motion.
Thank you.
And I have to give notice that if there is somebody who feels aggrieved by this decision, they have the right to file either a reconsideration or an appeal from our decision today within 30 days. Okay. So that matter is closed. Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Since we do have a number of board members that are not here today, maybe you could remind the public that's attending in terms of the number of votes required to pass is a majority of the full board, and that requires 5 positive votes out of the 6 of us that are present.
And you did a good job just there. But yes, what Mr. Burkhardt is referring to, to the other members who have matters pending before us, is we don't have a complete board before us right now. There's 9 of us, and you have to have 5 votes to approve a motion, and that 5 still stands even if there's fewer than all 9 of us here. So with that, we'll go to the next matter, which is case number 2009-079. The applicant is Rusty Klein. This is a request for a variance from AMC 2140-040.G.1, allowing a 3-square-foot corner of a detached garage accessory structure to encroach 2.2 feet into the required 20-foot front yard setback at its greatest point of encroachment, approximately 11% variance, as well as under AMC 2140-040G2 to allow a second-story exterior staircase and an unroofed deck greater than 30 inches above grade to encroach 1 foot into the required 5-foot setback at the greatest point of encroachment, which is a total of a 20% variance. At this point, if we could have staff address the variance request.
Mr. Chairman, there were 110 public hearing notices mailed out. 3 were returned in favor. The petitioner has supplied in the supplemental comments additional signatures from adjoining property owners who support the variance request. Mr. Chairman, the petitioner, at the time that this was submitted, was the property owner, Rusty Klein. In the interim between then and now, this evening, the property sold to Heather McGee and John Lackley. And I believe both the previous and the current property owners will likely want to be heard this evening. The property is zoned R2D, and it is located in the Spenard area. Benson Subdivision Block 2, Lot 21. I'd call your attention to page 3, which is the as-built of the property that depicts Klamath Drive, which is a diagonal street. This is if you look on page 2, you'll notice that the subdivision is triangular shaped, and the roads themselves form a triangle between Klamath, Breezewood Drive, and Malibu Road, just south of Spenard Road. The petition property is trapezoidal in shape. It has access to Klamath Drive, and as you can see, there is a detached garage that sits in the front of the property, and there is a triangular shaped corner of the 2.2 feet of the building, or 3 square feet, is what is the front yard encroachment. The second variance is the deck on what would be the northwest side boundary, and it encroaches into the side yard by 1 feet. The structure on the property is a duplex with a unit upstairs and a unit downstairs. There is, as I mentioned, a newly constructed or being constructed detached 2-story garage. and the lot is 6,750 square feet. Access to the second unit is via two exterior decks and stairways, and what we're dealing with is the one on the northeast side this evening. At the rear of the duplex, as you look on page 3, you'll notice a 10.3-foot wide storage addition to the residence. It encroaches into that rear yard setback. I've noted in the staff report that originally that was a requested variance, but the explanation is that was given to us is that that building was constructed as temporary storage for the equipment and materials needed to construct the garage by the owner, and that on completion of the garage, that building addition was going to be removed. So that is attested to by the new owner as well as the previous original owner. And so because they both have testified that it would be removed, we've withdrawn that as a variance request this evening. As I mentioned, the access is from Klamath Drive. There is an asphalt gravel parking pad driveway that extends 80% across the front of the lot. Klamath Drive is a local street roadway. It is unusual in that it's only a 30-foot right-of-way, and as my information is, it is a 25-foot strip paved roadway at this time. On-street parking is not permitted. There is a 4-foot chain link fence that surrounds the side and rear property lines. The topography of the lot at one time probably was sloping from the street in an upslope fashion that rose about 3 to 4 feet in elevation. But as photographs show, both the house and the garage are built at grade. The rear of the house, however, is built into that slope somewhat. There is a block retaining wall, however, that is less than 2 foot in height. That divides the parking area from the lawn in front of the house. I identified 4 issues that I've discussed and in some ways resolved. One was the use of the property. Originally, the building permit for the garage identified the second floor as possible. There were conflicting identifiers, whether that was going to be an office or another dwelling unit. Originally, it appeared as though it was going to have a full closet, a full bath, a washer-dryer room, and it had been drawn in that there would have been a kitchen sink and a faded or an erased area for a refrigerator, which gave the appearance that it was going to be another dwelling unit. However, a third dwelling unit above the garage would be a violation to the R2D district. Only a single principal structure is allowed in the R2D. So a duplex is allowed. It's one structure. And I noted also that it does not, it would not be allowed as a grandmother apartment or an accessory dwelling unit because the lot size has to be 20,000 square feet in the R2D district for that to have occurred and to have been legal. The building permit also suggested that the garage would be used as a auto repair, which was not allowed in the R2D district. However, the new owner has clarified that the top floor will not be used as a dwelling unit, and it will not be used as a home occupation beyond what is currently allowed by the code, which would be 200 square feet. The remainder of that area is intended for their personal hobbies and home office arrangements, as any property owner would have. I've mentioned the driveway. That would require going before the plating board for a variance, or they have to construct a driveway that would meet the code. I've also mentioned about the storage area, which is temporary behind the duplex, and they have assured us that that is going to be removed. Standard number 1, I believe, is partially met, given the discussion of the shape of the lot, the age of the subdivision, and the sort of non-traditional road design of the roads in the subdivision. It was platted prior to 1952. However, the lot is legally conforming in the R2D district. By today's standards, that road would have to have a 60-foot right-of-way, and as I mentioned, only a 30-foot is provided, which is substandard. I also point out that at the time that the building permit was requested, that they had attached a non-conventional as-built plot plan, which the nomenclature is wrong, because it's identified as a mortgagee's inspection as-built, which was a type of as-built used by lending and financial institutions during the 80s and the 90s on foreclosed properties, and it specifically notes that it is not to be used for positioning additional structures, nor for resolving conflicts between lot lines and easements, and it's not dimensioned. So it was an error of the building department to have even accepted that as part of the building permit application. A proper as-built plot plan would have required the seal and signature of a professional land surveyor, and additionally, it would have required that everything had to be, the building footprint dimensions would have to be shown, and so forth. With regard to the stairway, everything that I could research and document would be back to 1970 from a photograph that shows the existence of an unroofed external stairway and landing on that northwest side of the house. And it appears generally to be of the same dimension and obviously the same location. So it could be argued possibly that it could have some non-conforming characteristics, but none have been established. And as I mentioned, I discussed variance number 3, which is withdrawn, but only for purposes of describing what it was or could have been. But now that it's been withdrawn, we don't need to discuss it. The hardship question on number 3 is partially met. We're assuming that the design of the house, being an up-down duplex, speaks to the nature of the need for external access. We require 2 fire exits, entrances. It's a health and safety requirement. And so it could be argued that due to that design and the function of the building, that the peculiarity does exist with regard to number 2. With regard to number 1 and number 3, I think there is, it could be argued that because they had the wrong type of, quote, as-built with the building permit, they merely measured incorrectly to the street rather than, I think what they did is they did a 90-degree dimension, thinking that that conformed with the 20 feet, but in fact you have to take the shortest distance from the corner to the lot line, and that's what in fact gives us the need for the 2.2 foot encroachment. Standards number 4, I find met. We're talking about a 3 square foot triangular portion of that garage. It's not unusual in this neighborhood, if you drive down that street, to not know exactly where the front yard is on these various residential lots. It does not appear to be it doesn't appear to be an obvious encroachment. Standard 5 is met. This is a dimensional and not a use variance. Number 6 is met because it is a health safety issue with regard to the deck and the stairway. And it does not appear that the public is adversely impacted to the roadway, utilities, drainage, or site distancing onto the roadway. PM&E and traffic had no objection. And number 7 is met because it is the minimum variance necessary. And with that, I would recommend that the standards are met or partially met, and conditions number 1 through 7 found on pages 15 and 16.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask for a clarification from you for a second? If you could help me calculate, I guess, or how is the actual encroachment calculation done? Because if you look at what is it, page 3 of the packet, it's 50-foot wide strip, 20-foot deep, and then we have a 3 square foot encroachment. Why wouldn't that be like?
The line I've drawn. Okay, you have the edge of the property, and then you have I've drawn 20 feet back from both lot lines, and I show a line through the lot, which would be the 20-foot front yard setback. So the portion of the encroachment is that little portion of the north corner of that building into the property's asphalt driveway and parking area.
No, I see that. And what I was wondering is if we measure the encroachment by square footage, would we also measure the area not to be encroached upon by square footage? And wouldn't that be 1,000 square feet if we did that? Or where do we take our starting and ending point for determining what area is being encroached?
Well, it's 2 feet at the greatest point of encroachment of the corner. And by calculating the dimension of the triangle, it comes to 2.2 feet.
And that I understand. And I may not be articulating it clearly, but I'm trying to figure out how we reached the determination that it was an 11% variance as opposed to maybe a 0.03% or a de minimis variance.
I calculated that the 2.2 feet into the 20 foot is an 11% variance.
I see that. But why would we calculate the encroachment but using square footage but not in the area that is being encroached?
It's not the square footage. It is the point of the dimension or the depth of the encroachment is 2.2 feet.
Okay, and that's our trigger point then?
That's your trigger.
Okay, got it. All right, thank you. Now, there may be others who have questions for staff, so... yes, Mr. Freitas.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify, if I'm understood the presentation and I'm reading the notes in the packet.
Mr. Freitas, if you can get into the microphone.
Want to understand this correctly. The applicant did, in fact, build the original garage without a permit, and then there was a stop order issued?
No. He had a permit for the garage, and it was issued on this strange as-built, this mortgagee's inspector.
When was that permit issued?
That was issued, I believe, in that was in 2005.
Okay, because on page 6 of your packet, it says April of 2002, stop work order issued.
Yeah, there was. He started it, I gather, by initiating some foundation work and that kind of thing. It was identified. He was told to come in and get the building permit. He was building it out of pocket. Came in 2005. Then they went out a month later and discovered that there was this addition to the back of the house that wasn't part of the original building permit. So he was required to get a change order. However, as I understand it, and he will have to explain it to you, is that he proceeded to finish the garage, but had told the building inspector that he was not going to keep that additional temporary storage, and therefore he didn't need the change order. And my understanding is that the building inspector didn't remove the note from the file.
Okay, so we have what appears to be, the garage construction was started without a building permit. Stop order was issued.
Right.
Then a building permit was issued 30 years later.
Yes.
With a erroneous as-built survey, the lender's as-built survey.
Yes.
Then there's also notes in here that appears that on top, the second floor of the garage appears to be intended originally for living quarters, and now we're having affidavits stating it won't be used for that.
That's correct.
Okay. I guess my question would be that staff is quite comfortable then with this series of events, that they'll be corrected?
Yes, sir, I am. If you look at the conditions of approval, we're requiring, as an example, that prior to the variance becoming effective, condition number 1, that they have to remove that storage unit in the back, and it has to be inspected, and they have to provide documentation. Condition number 3 is that in order to get a final CO, that storage unit has to be removed and verified.
But we're not requiring anything then to remove the full bathroom or the kitchen counters?
Well, I'm getting to that.
Oh, okay.
Condition number 6 basically says that it shall not be converted into a dwelling unit. There's nothing in the code that does not allow, in other words, anyone can have a bathroom in their garage. Anyone can have a washer and dryer in their garage. They can have clothes closets in their garage. What they can't have is a full kitchen. And so that is a verifiable item at the time that they go to do the certificate of occupancy, that these will not be in there. So, yes, to answer your question, staff is satisfied that those items will not occur.
Thank you.
Questions for staff from any other board member? Seeing none, if we could have who are we considering the petitioner now at this point? Or Mr. Burkhart, do you have a question?
Yes, just to amplify Mr. Friedrich's question. Since we're putting that as a condition of approval, would that void the variance if?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Are we calling on Mr. Klein or the new owner?
I think the board is going to want to hear from both, and they can decide how they want to split the time, because I think it's important that Mr. Klein provide you with the background and the current property owner give you the assurances of what their intentions are.
Okay, if Mr. Klein could come forward, please. Yeah.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Rusty Klein. I'm a union carpenter. I've been a union carpenter for almost 20 years. And this was my home since 1996 is when I purchased it. We'll just start with the side deck. That was in question, would be variance number 2, I believe. That was existing. I never did anything to it other than fix some dilapidated hand railing. We never changed the footprint of it. The property was built in 1969. It's kind of an older property. And my intentions were to build a nice double-car garage. I kind of wanted to build a man's garage, if you will. I wanted to have a big shop, and I wanted to have storage space on top that I could that had a bathroom in it, and that had pretty much, I could throw a washer and dryer in there. I mean, for all of our construction clothes and things of that nature. I wasn't intending to live in it. I wasn't building it that way, but I did build it pretty nice. I built it as sturdy and as professionally as I possibly could. There were several hurdles to overcome and a lot of learning curves in this project. As she stated, she's very correct as far as that variance on the setback, the 20-foot setback. When I checked with the Muni and got the advice from planning and zoning, they said you go out 20 feet from the front of your structure to the property line. And so that's what we did. If you were to look at the garage layout, if you were to go straight out, it's actually 21 feet. We set it back an extra foot just to make sure we didn't have any problems. But in my ignorance, and it is completely my mistake, they measure on a diagonal, and it comes up short of the 20-foot mark. I guess, but in a defensive standpoint, prior to pouring any concrete on our foundation, I had one of the Muni inspectors out there with me, and he was inspecting our foundation before the concrete pour, and I asked him if he could double-check the numbers with me, and he did the same thing. We measured straight out, and he got 21 feet as well, and on his verbal, I was comfortable with ordering the concrete, and we did so. We proceeded. There's quite a span in there from 2002 where we started prepping the property and looking at how and where to locate the building to 2005 when we actually pulled the permit. And that just basically took quite a while for me to get the funds to be able to start the project. I wasn't ever trying to do anything shady. I tried to stay above board with the Muni on all counts and all my inspections, and I was asking a lot of questions, but I didn't apparently ask some of the right ones. The building structure on the back is a temporary storage space. We put a lot of our tools and sensitive building material that we were trying to keep out of the weather there, and then transfer them up front. I mean, if you were to see the structure, it's temporary. And the new owners are under everything above board with them as far as disclosures. They're aware of all of this. I was unaware about our zoning plot. When we did the permit, we took down the plot that we had for the property at the time, and with our drawings that our architect drew up for us, and everything was signed off by the muni, so we thought we were good to go. We had no idea that that zoning, or I had no idea that that zoning plot was unacceptable until I went to go sell the property, and then I had a new one. Obviously, my real estate agent had a new one done, and that's when we found out these issues came up. But I've always had good luck with this muni, and always worked well with the inspectors, and certainly wasn't trying to shadow anyone's. We weren't trying to get away with anything. Actually, we've been above board all the way. But it is a very nice structure, and I mean, it could very well easily have been made into an apartment, but that's not what our intentions were. I wouldn't be able to live in it. It's too small. I have a wife and 4 kids, so. But the new owners are, I believe, will tell you the same thing. They're planning on using it for a hobby and storage area. And everything that we put in as far as plumbing for a sink, I mean, it's not finished on the inside. It's all raw, framing still, the electrical's in and the plumbing lines are in, but it is stubbed out. You could put a sink in, and it is stubbed out for a washer and dryer in a bathroom facility. But, yep, there's this, I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't know your name.
Marion.
Marion has been extremely helpful in this whole process from the time that we realized we had problems to getting us to here. And I do thank her for her patience, because I was extremely confused. And I don't know, does anyone have any questions as the man who built the building and that I might be able to answer?
And that was going to be my next question. Does anybody from the board have any questions for Mr. Klein? Ms. Croft.
Mr. Klein, I was wondering, on the upstairs duplex that the stair goes to, there are currently 2 stairs that lead up to that duplex?
Yes, ma'am. The one that you see is the front entrance, the main entrance to it. The other one comes off of the back, that has a sliding back exit, and goes down into the backyard, which wouldn't be, you'd have to see the topography of the land that's quite an aggressive slope. It wouldn't be accessible for a front door access.
If we would require, by not granting the variance, if we would require that stair be removed or cut back, is there a viable alternative for an entrance to that?
No, ma'am, there really isn't. Well, it's kind of hard. The photo that you guys are provided with is if you look at the front page, when you see the new garage structure, if you could envision the main structure in the back to the left, there's a porch back there, and the stairs go out to the back end, and the retaining wall. What you don't see is how actual steep and around the corners you would have to go. It wouldn't make for a very easy front entry, I could say that. So the main entry comes up, and there's concrete stairs that go off to the right, and then up to that staircase and landing, like I said, which was that way in there when I bought it in 1996. I'm sorry.
So that again, that is the front door of the duplex that we're talking about.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Burkhart?
Yes, my question has to do with the Klamath Drive being rather having a shorter width. Am I correct? Is that a one-way street?
No, sir. It's a two-way street, and one of the... Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me click that off. One of the reasons we did the building layout and everything that we could is to have off-street parking so that vehicles weren't out on the roadway, because I know when the new graders come through, they really do have a difficult time with that street. So that was one of the reasons we set it up the way we did, so that the residents of that unit didn't have to be out onto that main street.
And I guess you do understand, or you or the new property owner, that the issue about the driveway, that you're going to have to go to the planning board to resolve that issue. Is that correct?
I've just kind of found out about that myself, but I do believe that we're all aware of what they're saying.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other board members who would like to ask any questions of the petitioner? Seeing none, Ms. Autor, if you have any comments or rebuttal?
No comment.
Now we go to the next petitioner, or the new homeowner.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello? State your name for the record.
My name is Heather McGee.
And I'm John Mackey.
Good evening.
We were asked by Mary about basically the safety corridor through the neighborhood, and we did go out and measure. We provided in the supplemental packet, letter C. John did a drawing of the layout of where this garage is located versus the next northern structure from us, which is 2811 Klamath. And we came up with 65 feet between the two structures. That was one item that wasn't discussed at all tonight. And then the other information that I provided was I provided some photos of the interior of the upstairs showing that it is unfinished. There is no living space there. We don't intend it to be a living space. We're both artists, and we want that space. The duplex itself is very small. It's 864 square feet in the basement unit where we live, and this is area for us to expand with our different creative projects and have some home office space, which I did lay out in the supplemental information. And I also went around and talked to all of the neighbors that I could find. There are some units where they're owned and both rented, and I couldn't contact the owners. But I did go over exactly what the issues were and got signatures from them indicating that they didn't have any problems with it.
Okay. Sir, would...
I don't know that I really have anything else to add to that, but I think that pretty much covers it.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the board? Okay, seeing none. Ms. O'Toole?
Mr. Chairman, I would just point out that I think that the new owners have demonstrated that what the impact is to the property to the north. They've also shown photographs providing you with the edge of the street. And if you look at the photographs, I think you'll notice that none of the properties have met the required driveway width. And I think that is a function of the fact that this is such an old substandard road and that houses just there was nothing really. If they had put that in there, I think it would have made it more difficult for the people to park. And so this is Spenard, and it's an old subdivision, old part of town, and this is very typical development.
Okay. Thank you. With this, we will open it up to public testimony.
Thank you.
Are there any members of the public who would like to speak to? Good evening, ma'am. If you could state your name for the record.
Good evening. My name is Sue Button. I live adjacent or across the street from the petitioner's address. My address is 2811 Klamath. Basically, what I have to add to this is that, yes, it's very definitely a typical Spenard neighborhood. It is a very narrow street. The garage that's been added does not impact the neighborhood at all. I realize that there is concern about the side deck. However, I would estimate that 80% of the houses on that particular street have decks that are built like that are in fact the front or the basement entries. That is primarily owner-occupied duplexes on that street. So that this side deck, I don't know if it's still an issue or not. That everybody has those on that street because it is such an old subdivision. As far as the garage, I know there was a concern about the garage being built for a mother-in-law apartment. I can pretty much attest that that will not happen because we have actually a neighborhood that keeps an eye on everyone that goes through that neighborhood, and if there was any concern about that at all, I can pretty much guarantee you that the board would hear about it. So as a neighbor and as a homeowner in that area, I have absolutely no qualms about the variance that's being petitioned.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions from the board for Ms. Button? Thank you, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry? Okay, thank you, ma'am. Are there any other members of the public who would like to offer testimony regarding this matter? Okay, seeing none. Mr. Freitas, you had a question for the staff?
Yes, thank you. I'm got a concern and a question, I guess, about how this is being measured as well, and I think it was alluded to a little bit earlier. Why is that being measured diagonally to the front of the property line? I always thought that it was measured parallel to the lot lines to get the 20 feet. Is that incorrect?
Yes, that is incorrect. It's the shortest distance to the lot line.
Thank you.
Okay, at this point, we close the public testimony, and the matter now rests with the board. We'll take an affirmative motion and a second. Let's see what we have here. Ms. Croft has made a motion. Mr. Vig has seconded it. Ms. Croft, you have the floor.
I move that in the case 2009-079, we grant a variance in the R2D district from AMC 21.40.040 G1 to allow a 3-square-foot corner of a detached garage accessory structure to encroach 2.2 feet into the required 20-foot front yard setback at the greatest point of encroachment, and from AMC 21.40.040 G2 to allow a second-story exterior staircase and unroofed deck greater than 30 inches above grade to encroach 1 foot into the required 5-foot side yard setback at the greatest point of encroachment, subject to conditions 1 through 7 as shown on page 15 and 16 in the staff packet.
Okay. And Mr. Vig? Second it? Okay. Ms. Croft, if you'd like to speak towards your motion.
I intend to support the motion. I believe that the standards are substantially met. I believe in Standard 1 that there exist exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances on the property to be met. We talk about the shape of the lot is obviously unusual, and we talked about the age of the subdivision and the unusual road design and how that has an impact on the land and on the siting of the buildings on that land. So I feel that standard is met. In terms of standard number 2, because these physical circumstances, the strict application of the code would create exceptional or undue hardship. Again, I feel that standard is partially met. I do believe that the problem with the garage did have to do with the fact that it is an unusual shaped lot, and the fact that it was an angular front property line contributed at least to the incorrect measuring of that. And so that even though the intention was made, the intention was to have that 20 foot back from the property line, it was a measuring error that resulted partially, at least from the shape of the lot. And let me see. In terms of standard number 3, the hardship is not self-imposed. Again, I feel that at least it's partially, I agree with staff that it is partially met. In the case of the duplex, and given the siting of the duplex, I think it is difficult to get the access needed for the second-story duplex without encroaching on that side yard. As the petitioner stated, it would be difficult to relocate that to another location. So I see that is not being self-imposed. And I also see that the need for the garage and off-street parking is required because of the nature of the the subdivision and the nature of that street. So I understand the need for that garage. In terms of standard 4, the variance if granted would not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. I agree with staff that the standard is met, and the new owners also showed by their property layout how there is over 60 feet between the new garage and the property across the street. So I don't believe that there's any safety concerns associated with that. In terms of standard 5, variance is in keeping with the intent of this code, will not change the character of the zoning district. As everyone has attested to, including the neighbor, this does seem to fit in with the Spenard neighborhood there and would not change that character at all. And again, on standard 6, the variance would not adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the people of the municipality of Anchorage. As I mentioned before, the dimension between this building and the one across the street seems sufficient. And this variance is required also to maintain the safety of the second-story unit to allow 2 means of egress from that dwelling unit. And on standard 7, the variance granted is the minimum variance that will make possible a reasonable use of this land. I do believe that a 3-square-foot variance is about as minimum as we're going to get in terms of that one. And on the side yard, it is just a foot, and I believe that you could not make those stairs any smaller and still have them meet code for egress. So I do believe that standard has been met as well.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Vig?
I agree with staff's interpretations of the standards and Ms. Croft's explanations of her positions, and would expand on standard number 1 is in addition to the layout of the subdivision and the age, the narrow rights of way in many ways restrict the ability to address some of these issues in other ways and create some needs for, as she mentioned, off-street parking, and certainly with standard number 2, strict application of this code would create an exceptional or undue hardship. Certainly with regard to the deck and the stairway, which is a provision for secondary egress, or actually the front entrance to the house, that trying to reconfigure that would be a pretty significant hardship. And as far as the garage goes, the minor, in my opinion, aspect of that encroachment is something that would require an exceptional effort to fix. And with regard to standard number 3, although the applicant or petitioner initially began the garage construction without a building permit, he did make every effort to comply with the requirements, and in fact solicited some input and assistance from municipal staff, and erroneously used an as-built that perhaps shouldn't have been, but it was accepted by the building department, and so I believe that it wasn't entirely the actions of the applicant that created the need for that variance. So for those 3, I wanted to expand, and I concur with the findings that the other standards are met for the reasons explained previously.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Other board members who would like to speak relative to the pending motion? I have 2 things I would like to say regarding it. I noted that the petitioner, Mr. Klein, who did a very nice job, by the way, presenting the factual background to us, the staff had the opportunity to clarify or rebut statements that you provided, and there was no rebuttal when you testified that an city inspector had come out and measured with you before the pour. And I find that also, along with Mr. Vig, I think to be pretty important. issue, and it also relates to something Ms. Croft said, and that is the property is not rectangular, and the method that was used by Mr. Klein and the city inspector probably assumed that the lot was rectangular, and you gave yourself a 1-foot margin of error even, and measured twice before you cut, so to speak, and it still ended up in a little bit of a encroachment. What I see with all this is really these were good faith actions. There was no bad faith here, and a de minimis encroachment, in my opinion, anyways. In looking at the totality of this, and I intend to vote in favor of it. No further comments. We are ready to take a vote. It appears that this motion passes unanimously. So I have to inform anyone who may be aggrieved by this that they could file an appeal or reconsideration of this 30 days after the city issues its written findings, I believe. Other than that, the matter is closed. You want to take a break? Okay. It's freezing in here. We're going to go off record and take a 5-minute break. Is that right? Okay.
Can you turn the heat up a little bit?
Okay.
Take a lap around the building. Yeah. Start up my engine.
Yeah.
I'm guessing.
I keep forgetting my coat.
All right, we're ready to come back to order here. We're now back on the record, and before us we will be going to the third case on our agenda, which is case number 2009-095. The applicant is Sandor Manioki, and this is a request for a variance from AMC 2155-020 regarding a lot that does not conform to its underlying zoning district for lot area or lot width, or both, maintaining the setbacks of the zone with the largest area requirement in which the lot would conform, the lot area that most closely meets the requirement for the R7 district. The R7 requires a front yard setback of 25 feet, whereas the R6 district requires 50 feet. So this is a request to allow a 1.7-foot encroachment into the 25-foot setback. Mr. Barrett, are you handling this?
Yes.
Please proceed.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The property was advertised and posted. 52 public hearing notices were mailed out for this case. We did not receive any responses at all. On page 2, you will see the current as-built of the property. Page 3 is an older as-built that was submitted as a plot plan for the addition of the Arctic entryway on the north side of the house facing East 112th Avenue. You can see hand sketched in where it mentions a 7 by 11 addition and shows the dimensional arrows indicating a 25-foot setback from the property line to the front of the Arctic entryway. The lot is 46,500 square feet in size. It is non-conforming for the R6 district, even when half the right-of-way is added in. So we are using the R7 standards, since that is the lot size it most closely fits. The house is set back 30 feet from the front lot line. The owner applied for the permit to add the 77 square foot entry in 2006. It was called out by the plan reviewers that a 25-foot setback was required. Yet when the final closeout survey was done, it was discovered that the Arctic entry encroached 1.7 feet into that setback. Regarding the standards, number one, there exist exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances. The standard is partially met. The lot's not got physically unusual properties such as streams, slopes, or wetlands. However, the house was under construction before platting was in place, and the lot was platted before zoning was enacted. So the house has a history of a lot going on before the rules were in place. The lot is substandard for R6, but we do compensate for this by allowing the less restrictive R7 setbacks. The house does appear to have been placed fairly forward on the lot to allow for the septic system in the rear yard. If you look at either of the drawings on pages 2 and 3, you'll see the locations of the septic vents in the backyard area. I don't have any test borings or statements from septic installers as to that actually being the reason. Perhaps the applicant can enlighten us, but it does seem a logical reason. Regarding standard number 2, because of the physical circumstances, strict application would create an exceptional or undue hardship. The standard is partially met. It's only partially met because standard number 1 is only partially met. However, the lot is small. The house was begun and the lot platted before the rules were fully in place. There is enough area in lot size to have accommodated a house, garage, and Arctic entry for appropriate size for this size lot. The issue really results from a measurement error, the setback from the street. Standard number 3, the hardship is not self-imposed. This is the only standard that is not truly met. For Part A of this standard, the standard is partially met because the first 2 standards are partially met. But for the second part of this standard, the need for the variance does result from the actions of the applicant. The applicant turned it in a permit application. It was noted that the structure required a 25-foot setback, but the entry was built with the resulting encroachment, and it was not discovered until the final CO. Standard number 4, the variance, if granted, will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. This standard is substantially met. There are no structure separation violations. The house, the enlargement, the Arctic entryway does not encroach any traffic vision problems. the encroachment is not overtly obvious. There are some color photographs beginning on page stamped number 43. You can see the house, the garage, and the Arctic entryway on it. Those pictures are taken from approximately the middle of the street. You can see it's not a very obtrusive encroachment. Regarding standard number 5, if granted is in keeping with the intent of the code, the standard substantially met. This is dimensional, not a use issue. The intent of this part of the code is to provide front yards and make certain that structures are located safely back from the right-of-way. And in this case, with the house still, with the Arctic entryway, still approximately 23 feet from the edge of the right-of-way, that does not seem to be an issue. Regarding standard number 6, does not adversely affect the health, safety, welfare. The standard is met. No building separation or fire issues, no drainage issues, no objections received from the neighborhood or the community council. And standard number 7 is the minimum variance granted. That standard is substantially met. You could say that a reasonable use existed prior to the construction of an Arctic entryway. Nevertheless, an Arctic entry is a highly desirable feature. A smaller entry might have been able to meet the yard setback, but on the other hand, an encroachment of 1.7 feet is a relatively minimum encroachment considering the 25-foot front yard requirement. The department does recommend denial as standard 3 is not substantially met. If the board finds for approval, we have only the one standard condition for recording the notice of zoning action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Do we have, we already do, questions for Mr. Barrett? Mr. Burkhart, you are first.
Mr. Barrett, I guess I'm curious why this wasn't approved as an administrative variance. That it appears R6, the front yard threshold would have been 4.4 feet, and for R.7 it would, R7 it would be 2.3 feet, and both of those are larger than the 1.7 feet encroachment.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Burkhart, that's correct. Even under the R7 standard, the encroachment of 1.7, as noted in the report under Standard 7, does fall within the limit for administrative variances. In discussing this with the division that makes that call as to whether or not it's an administrative variance, their decision, and I'm sorry I don't have this in writing, this was at a staff meeting, their decision was that because of how and why and who was responsible for the error, it did not fall under the administrative variance procedures. And I think we can all sympathize with that, recalling last month's discussion and the issues we're having with administrative variances.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Vig, you have a question.
Mr. Burkhart's question was answered, and that dealt with mine.
Okay. Any other board member have a question for staff? Seeing none, if the petitioner could please come forward. Good evening. If you could state your name for the record, and you have up to 10 minutes to discuss your issues with us.
My name is Stephen Callahan. I'm actually representing Mike Anderson, who had an emergency this evening at about 6 o'clock. They asked me to attend the meeting in his place.
What would be your relationship with him? Agent or neighbor?
We're just, I guess, say business associates. He's engineer, and we know each other, you know.
Mr. Barrett, do we have any technical problems without having a formal designation of agency, or can we accept the representation?
Mr. Chairman, I would say let's accept the representation. and I will get with Mr. Anderson tomorrow an official letter authorizing this substitution.
Okay. And that didn't go against your time, so please proceed.
Okay, the information I was given was a letter written by Mike Anderson. It starts on the page 27 of the packet that was handed out. I'd like to emphasize the fact that the Arctic entryway was constructed to the current building codes, and as a result, to meet the building codes, the encroachment is approximately 1.7 feet into the 25-foot setback. One of the reasons I believe that the encroachment occurred was to meet the approved building plans that were submitted for the project. I'm not sure if building plans were actually submitted for this small of a project, but there are building codes, and those building codes had to be met for this Arctic entryway. Typically, I'm aware that permits are procured by the applicant for these projects. Anything over a certain dollar amount, I believe it's $5,000 in improvements, requires a building permit. So, as part of the project, it's my understanding that they had to enlarge the Arctic entryway to meet the building codes, in particular pertaining to the stairway that was already in existence as part of the original structure of the building. I'm not exactly sure how that worked, but that's my understanding, that there was some building safety issues that had to be met, which led to the lengthening of the Arctic entryway. I do not believe the character of the neighborhood has changed much. I've seen the exterior of the house numerous times with the new Arctic entryway, and I don't believe the character of the neighborhood has changed as a result of this project. And the existing road is a gravel road. I don't think that the road will be improved. It's a very low traffic road, and I don't think there'll be a need for widening the right-of-way or acquiring easements from the property owner. That's basically all.
Thank you, sir. Questions from any board members? We have one from Mr. Burkhardt.
Does the petitioner happen to be here tonight?
Neither the petitioner, I believe the petitioner is out of state, I'm looking around now, I don't see the Mike Anderson of Anderson Engineering.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Barrett, do you have any questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, have you been inside the Arctic entry?
I think I have, but I don't think I paid much attention. I mean, I've been in the house. I noticed it when I first pulled up to the house and it was new. I noticed it, but honestly, since that time, I haven't noticed the Arctic entry. I know one of the reasons for putting it on was to prevent snow from falling on you when you walked into the house, because there was a tendency that snow would pile up on the roof. You'd walk into the house, occasionally snow would slough off.
But as soon as you're into the house proper, you're at an immediate landing where there are stairs up and down?
Yes, it's a split-level type house, and when you walked into the house, I remember years ago walking into the house initially, prior to the Arctic entry, I remember noticing that there was a very small landing, and there were steps immediately going up and steps immediately going down. I think one of the reasons for the Arctic entry was to accommodate a larger landing, to have more space there. And there was also, I believe, a grade change, and I think there was a step in the Arctic entry, a step or two, as you walked into the Arctic entry and went up onto a landing.
So it's safe to say structural inspection or code abatement said the Arctic entry has to come out a little bit further to provide adequate area before you hit that landing of the stairs going up and down.
I believe so.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
I have a question for you, sir. Are you saying then that the need for the Arctic entry in its present form has a safety element, both from protecting potential visitors and occupants from snow drop-off from the roof, giving them clear, safe access in, as well as from the landing itself?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I remember going to the house and commenting on how, snow could be a problem here.
The metal roof?
I'm not sure. I believe it's...
It looks like it is in the...
Yeah, I believe it's a metal roof with the corrugations.
Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Freitas.
Do I understand it correctly that the structural department required them to move the Arctic entry out a little bit to have additional distance to that step-up landing?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Freitas, I don't see anything in the file definitively indicating that, but that does sound reasonable.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, sir. Seeing that, we will see if there's anyone who would like to offer public testimony on this matter. Please come forward now. Okay, doesn't appear that there's anybody who would like to offer any public testimony. Technically, Mr. Barrett has the right to rebut anything that has been provided. Would you like to take the opportunity? Okay. With that, then the public testimony is closed. I will not bring the gavel down. And the matter now rests before the board. If we could have an affirmative motion and a second. All right, we have a motion by Mr. Ron and a second by Mr. Freitas. Mr. Ron, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the case of 2009-095, I move to grant a variance in this instance where the lot is zoned R6 but does not conform to R6 size requirements. The variance is granting a request to allow a 1.7-foot encroachment into the 25-foot setback, and that relates to AMC 21.55.020, which provides that a lot which fails to be conforming in its underlying zone, district, for lot area or lot width, or both, shall maintain the setbacks of the zone with the largest area requirement in which the lot would conform. The lot area most closely meets the requirement for the R7 district. The R7 requires a front yard setback of 25 feet, hence using R7 rather than R6. Move that we grant that variance subject to staff recommendation on page 10 of the staff packet.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Freitas seconds it. At this time, if you would like to speak towards your motion.
I agree with staff's assessment of the findings 1 and 2 and 4 through 7. Clearly, standard 3 is the sticking point here. In looking at page 47 of the staff packet, which provides an aerial view of East 112th Avenue, it's clearly shown that, as stated in the narrative as well, this house is close to the street, perhaps closer than those other adjacent houses. It appears that the current owner did not construct the original building in its first location. That said, I think the homeowner should enjoy a right to be able to build an Arctic entry, as the board has given special consideration to for its energy conservation impacts and effects. With the additional considerations for safety in terms of the split level entry, I find that the standard is at least partially met, if not substantially met, in terms of non-self-imposition of the hardship.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, sir. Mr. Freitas?
Yes, I agree. With the exception of number 3, I would also like to add, I think, as per the previous questions and assuming answers, if we are to assume in any way that the structural department did in fact request the Arctic entry to be moved out a little bit to allow for the stairs and that were existing in place as the landing prior to the construction of it, I believe that that would constitute a hardship that is not self-imposed, and I believe that that would further make standard number 3 more substantially met.
Thank you. Do we have any other board members who would like to speak towards this motion? Okay, seeing none, then we can bring it to a vote. The motion passes unanimously. Give notice to anyone who may be aggrieved by this decision that they will have 30 days to file an appeal or a motion for reconsideration after the staff has issued a final written ruling on this. Thank you, sir. That brings us to our next item, which is, case number 2009-091. The applicant is the Pioneer Estates Condos through owner David Cofield, or a representative, Mr. Cofield. And this is a request involving lots 4 and 5 from the Municipal Code 2145030, which requires a 10-foot separation between primary and accessory structures to allow carports and apartment buildings to be less than 10 feet apart, as well as a request on Lot 5 for a variance from AMC 2140045, requiring a 20-foot front yard setback to allow reconstruction of a deck which will encroach up to 3 feet into the 20-foot setback. Mr. Barrett, are you handling this?
Yes, sir.
Please proceed.
Thank you. The property was posted and advertised. 168 public hearing notices were mailed for this item. We received only one response. That was in opposition. The letter from the individual is in there. He cites 2 basic reasons: aesthetics and safety, namely traffic, vehicle, and pedestrian interaction. And aesthetics, that's something else. The traffic and pedestrian interaction, I think, is actually not an issue because of the locations of the decks and the setbacks that do exist. So nevertheless, we do have one letter in opposition. I do have a few photos I'd like to start around that were taken a little bit more recently and maybe in some instances show things a little bit better than some of the photos in the package. The plans for the 2 properties, Lot 4 and Lot 5, are on pages 2 and 3, respectively. And those as-builts, they are actually as-builts. These are not plot plans. They are from 2008, and they show the decks that were on the building that are now being replaced. Beginning with Lot 4, the as-built on page 2, you can see the carport running along the south portion of the property and the roughly U-shaped building with the opening facing to the west, and then a deck on the south side of that building. The building proper and the carport are separated by about 13 feet. When the deck is added, the separation between the building and the carport is only 7 feet. So that is the variance for Lot 4. Lot 5, the as-built on page 3, You can see the carport on the west side of the property, west of the condo building, and approximately where that carport makes a slight dogleg is where the separation between the carport and the building is less than 10 feet. And then on the east side of that building, you can see the original deck that was there when the drawing was made in 2008. And that deck, like the one on the lot 4 to the west, that deck has worn out and is being replaced. And because of the width of the deck, the yard setback is being violated on Lot 5. You might also notice that the carport on Lot 5 is only 6.6 feet from the property line. That was constructed prior to 1986, and we and the traffic engineer have looked at it, and it has been determined not to be a safety issue, even though it is only 6 feet from the property line. So the carport and the setback from the front lot line have been deemed to be a pre-1986 administrative type ruling, and a variance is not needed for that item. So those are the variances. I'm going to lump them all together in the general discussion, but we would recommend that everything be treated separately in the findings. The separation between the two buildings, one on Lot 4 and one on Lot 5, and then also the deck on the east setback on the building on Lot 5. So probably 3 separate findings, just in case some of the issues don't appear to be meeting these standards. And let me get into the standards. The lots are legal and conforming. They were platted in 1977. The setback rules were in effect at that time, although they have changed. They changed from R2 to R2M, but they're still the same in terms of the distance. So neither the carports or the buildings predate zoning. As best we can determine, well, I'm going to get into that as part of the standards, actually, discussing some of the history. Covered the variances and treating them separately. Let me just go right to the standards. Standard number 1, there exist extraordinary or exceptional physical circumstances. The standard is not substantially met for either lot. Both lots are double frontage, but they are large enough to accommodate the buildings that are on them, so the physical circumstances are at least minimally met, and it's not substantial enough of a physical situation to find that standard 1 has been met. The properties, as I say, do have double frontages. They have primary and secondary front yards, but an allowance on setbacks for this is made by deleting the requirement for a rear yard setback. The buildings and carports were built legally under code in effect at the time, but from the best we can tell, looking at old permits and old as-builts, the decks were not discussed as everything was going through the permit process. In any case, the situation for the decks and the carport separations has existed since at least 1981 without apparent adverse effect to the subject properties or to the neighboring properties. Regarding standard number 2, because of the physical circumstances, strict application would create a hardship. The standards partially met for both lots. The physical limitations affecting the properties are fairly weak. They are double frontage, but that's not an unusual situation. However, decks, carports, and garages are a common and desirable feature, and they are abundant throughout the subdivision. Just about everyone has a deck, and everyone, I believe, does have a carport space. Regarding standard number 3, the hardship is not self-imposed. The standard is not substantially met with some modifications. When we began going through this, we were unable to determine to any good degree when the decks were added such that the encroachment, the building separation encroachment, became obvious. The applicant has just today been able to find an aerial photo, I believe from 1979, which does show the decks under construction as part of the buildings. So this allows us to say that the decks have been there from the very start and have existed all this time without any apparent ill effects. However, based on the record, the permits, the as-built, and the plot plans submitted through the years as things were done to the property still don't give us a very good history, because in the as-built and the plot plans that we have, decks are not shown on the buildings, even though it's quite apparent from the early photos that they were there. So for that reason, we cannot say that Standard 3 is truly met, because we don't have a perfect history on the deck construction. Regarding Standard 4, the variance will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. The standard is at least partially met. There is one complaint from the neighborhood, but there is no traffic vision triangle impact due to these projections into the yards. The fire department and the structural code abatement people don't wholeheartedly support the variances, but that is because when there is a fire separation issue, they want to see both structures in question built to the current fire code minimum 1 hour firewall separation. That's not possible on the condo buildings because there are electrical and water conduit openings coming through the walls, and because in at least one case there are windows on the condo. So that wall of that building does not meet the firewall requirements, and then the carports themselves are not built to that standard because these are fairly minimal carports. It's a roof on supports to keep cars somewhat out of the weather. So in saying that standard number 4 is met, we can only say partially met because the fire inspectors will never be fully on board with it. It's just not desirable and perhaps not even possible to build both the carport and the condo building itself to the full firewall standard. Regarding standard number 5, the variance, if granted, is in keeping with the intent of the code. The standards partially met. The intent of the code here is to provide safe building separation, and we do have less than the 10-foot separation. However, decks and carports do not change the character of the district, and they are a highly desirable and common feature in the district. Standard 6, the variance does not adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare. The standard's not substantially met. Again, code abatement and fire are not going to sign off on 2 structures less than 10 feet apart unless both buildings can be shown to meet the minimum firewall requirements, and that's just something that won't happen, especially with the carports. Standard 7, the variance granted is a minimal variance to make possible a reasonable use of the land. The standard is partially met. The structures, the decks, could be made somewhat smaller, but it's going to either result in an unusable deck or still have some encroachment of the 10-foot separation. So at best, that standard can only be partially met, and since it could never most likely be fully met without completely removing the decks, we can say in a sense that what is there is minimal because the 10-foot encroachment is going to exist regardless. The department does recommend denial because the standards are not substantially met, and we do recommend treating the 3 items separately. If the board does find for approval, there are 2 conditions on page 10 Number one, or condition A is the standard recording of the notice, and standard B is to get an updated drawing for both lots because of some inconsistencies that we've seen on the grids, the plats, and the as-bills. And then, should it become necessary, we'd have the applicant provide letters of no objection from any utilities that might be affected as part of condition of approval B. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Ms. Croft, do you have a question for Mr. Barrett?
I did. Could you, I don't see here, I don't remember you saying what the actual distance is on Lot 5 between the carport and the apartment building?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Croft, I don't have it dimensioned, and this one is a shrunk-down version, I believe. It's pretty close. At the closest point of encroachment, I would say the separation on Lot 5 between the carport and the side of the condo is 8 feet.
And is that dimension, I'm looking at the photos that were passed around here, is that dimension to the roof, the structure on the roof does appear to be overhanging there are no walls of the carport, but if there were walls, it's substantially overhanging the walls, and would that make a difference in our interpretation of the 10-foot?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Croft, no, not in the fire separation issue. The overhang only counts in yard setbacks, but not for the 10 feet fire separation.
Okay, and then the other question I had is regarding the decks and their encroachment. Is it true that the encroachment is a problem for both the lower and the upper decks? The lower decks look to be below 30 inches above the grade, and I didn't know if that was also considered to be an issue.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Croft, the deck on the east side of the building on Lot 5, the lower deck would not be counted because you're correct, it is at grade. But for the lower deck on Lot 4, again, that's a different issue. It brings the buildings closer than 10 feet from each other, so it counts against it on Lot 4.
So 3 of the 4 decks, if you take them all together, 3 of the 4 decks you have a problem
Correct.
with? Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any, Mr. Freitas?
Yes, Mr. Barrett. Are there many other units in this with existing decks that are already existing encroachments similar to this?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Freitas, almost everybody there has a deck. If there are other encroachments, they're not overt, and I did not notice them.
The reason I ask is if you look at page 48 and you look at the property directly across from one of the ones that I believe is in question, that deck on the property on the right side looks like it's extremely close to the carport.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Freitas, it does from that angle, indeed, and I don't recall seeing that view from State Street, which is right across from the other one, or the one that we're looking at. I can't answer that.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Barrett? Mr. Barrett, usually we have the page that indicates other departments have signed off on it, and maybe that's on page 20 here, but I assume that the fire department didn't object?
Mr. Chairman, I did not get written comments from either fire or structural. Their statement was verbal, and that they won't overtly oppose it, but they're not going to say they have no objection if the firewall standards cannot be met, and left it at that.
Okay. Okay, at this time, we can open this matter for public testimony. Or, I'm sorry, first we have to have the representative, Mr. Cofield, come forward, and then we can have public testimony. So please come forward, Mr. Cofield.
Thank you. My name is David Cofield. I'm the board president this year for the Condo Association. And before I get into the points, are you prepared for me to proceed?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, please do.
I will try to address each of those 7 points with the association's view of them. But before I do, there's a couple of things that I want to make sure the board understands in terms of the timeline. First, I want to talk about 30 years ago when these properties were built. The 2 properties in question were permitted. Certificate of occupancy was issued on them in, I believe it was April 1979. At the time those 2 properties were built, if you looked at them by the standards that we're looking at them here today, the only non-complying issue would have been the deck on the east end of Lot 5. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The carports were built 2 years later. Those carports were permitted. Somebody came out and inspected them, had a chance to look the property over, see the distances between the carports and the building. They passed. Since then, people have been buying units in those buildings, selling units in those buildings. We've got a 28-year history of the original decks and the original carports at those properties existing just the way they are. Fast forward to today. Over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, the association board has been confronted with particularly the upper decks slowly but surely starting to fall apart. You know, the rails are rotting out. In some cases, the floors are, they were plywood floors, and they were collecting mold and starting to get to the point where if you stepped on them, you could feel, a spongy, bouncy feel to them. We had contractors come in and tell us, well, it's going to cost X amount of dollars to replace that. We started doing the math and said, this is going to kill us as an association if we don't find a way to do this economically.
Please get closer to the microphone.
Is this a little better? Sorry. So we undertook to do a complete replacement project across the entire association. Last year, our contractor, Alaska Tree Line, on behalf of the association, applied for permits for all 7 buildings in the association. 5 of those permits were granted. For reasons we still aren't completely sure of, the muni asked for as-bills on 2 of the properties. Those as-bills are in your packet on page 2 and 3. So those accurately represent the property today, or the property at the time, 2008. 50 of the 54 decks in the association have in fact been replaced. They are the exact dimensions that the original decks were. We didn't change the dimensions at all. If we're allowed to replace the remaining 4 decks, they will also be the exact dimensions of the original deck. The only thing that's changed in the deck design, well, the only significant thing, is the way the decks are supported. The original decks were cantilevered decks, with joists going back into the floors. These are pilings with support posts and then tied into the side of the building. Other than that, the dimensions, the look, the feel, everything about them is almost identical. When we submitted these plot plans, as-built, to our surprise, we had some non-compliance issues. We were caught off guard by this. We went down, talked to the permit people, and said, well, wait a minute, you got the yardage mixed up. The front yard's in the front, right? And they didn't agree with that. They insisted that the 20-foot setback had to be on north view, which would be to the west or east, and not the other way around. We couldn't get past them. So we wound up filing this variance. The carport on Lot 5 kind of got picked up as an aside. We'd like to be able to keep that carport if it ever gets torn down or blown down, or we had one actually blown down a few years ago. We'd like to be able to put it back, which is why we're asking for a variance on that as well. That gives you a little bit of a history. Mr. Barrett indicated that when they were originally preparing their analysis, there was the impression that the decks had been built after the fact. We had the buildings, the carports, and somewhere in those 2 years somebody built these decks without permits. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I originally had planned to cite every piece of evidence we could to convince you, the board, that these decks were in fact part of original construction. It wasn't something that the association came in later and said, hey, we'd kind of like to have decks. Let's see if we can slide one by. That didn't happen. If you want to look at the association as a whole, or every individual owner here today, what I want to communicate and make sure that you understand before I get into any of the rest of this is you've got a group of people who tries to dot their I's and cross their T's. That's part of the reason we're here. I have a photograph that was taken about a month after the original certificates of occupancy were issued on the property, the two buildings, not the carports. And this photograph, unlike others that we looked at, very clearly shows the decks. I only have this one copy, and if I may, I'll bring it over here and you can pass it down and look at it. I can try that. It was kind of hard to look to see.
See it?
Let's see if I can. Okay, there we go. So this is lot 5. I'm not very good at this. This is lot 4. And the lot 4 decks are pretty easy to see. You can see over here a deck and then 2 off the back on the lot 5. And this picture was taken about a month after these buildings were finally approved and the certificate of occupancy was issued. That's as close as I can get to clear, solid evidence that, these were original construction decks. Somebody didn't come back in and add them after the fact. You've got pictures in the packet that we presented that give you a head-on view. You can see second-story patio-style window sliding glass doors that are rear exits from the upper-story units. Those are part of original construction. You don't build those without putting something underneath them. Anyways, my point is those decks are part of original construction. Nobody came back and tried to bypass the permit system to put those in. Now I would like to address each of those 7 threshold requirements. Exceptional, extraordinary circumstances on the property. I think we do have some. I'll list them as well as I can here. First of all, these are not square lots. If you look at the plots that you have on page 2 and 3, you'll notice that lot 4, which is on page 2, angles to the west near the top. That necessarily prevents you from moving that building too far to the north. If you move it too far to the north, you start encroaching on the setbacks on the north end of the property. So the shape of that lot does necessarily force some positioning of that building toward the south. That's probably even more true of lot 5, where you've got a wedge-shaped lot. I want to point out that every condominium building in this association is an 8-unit building with the exception of the building on lot 5. It is a 6-unit building. It was smaller in size because that's all they could put on that lot with the wedge-shaped shape of the lot. If you want a parking lot and a building sitting there, you've got utility easements to the east that force positioning toward the west, especially if you want to put a decent parking lot in there. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit about the positioning of the carport on that lot. A couple of other things I'd like to point out that I think go to the uniqueness of this lot. I understand that physical structures on the lot aren't the kind of things that set the lot apart, that you're looking for geographic things or plotting things to set the lot apart. Something that I think, at least with respect to the association, sets this particular situation apart is even if all the I's and T's weren't dotted and crossed by the builder, The association inherited the buildings, the carports, the decks, just the way they are on this lot. If we're going to do anything at all with these properties, we have to deal with the existing structures as they stand or tear them down. So we're either going to find a way to put back what was there just the way it was, because that's all we can do, or we can't do anything at all. We're stuck with that characteristic.
And Mr. Goldfeld, I hate to interrupt, but if you could wrap up in about another minute. I suspect we'll hear testimony from some of the other homeowners that may cover some of the items you would you intended to cover.
Number 2 then. Strict application of the code would create exceptional or undue hardship. We've got 4 units with no decks. They have exit ways out into thin air. The hardship is obvious. Let me address the carport very quickly. That particular carport barely has enough room for its use right now. People backing out of that consistently. I've gone over myself and stood up an ACS cone and a GCI cable box, because people backing out of there bump into those on a fairly regular basis and knock them over. You wouldn't be able to move that carport back a couple of feet and still have room to maneuver in that area that's there and available. Short of tearing the carport out, that's another kind of hardship. Number 3, this idea that the hardship is self-imposed, I think I've addressed that about as well as I can at this point. This association did nothing to create this situation. It was an inherited situation. I can't tell you why the builder didn't draw the decks on the plans. I just know that they've been there for 30 years. The carports have been there for 28. Number 4, if granted, the variance won't adversely affect the use of adjacent property. There's nothing about what we're doing or asking for that will change anything that hasn't been there for 28 to 30 years. We're putting things back literally exactly as they were. Number 5, keeping the variance if granted is in keeping with the intent of the code, will not change the character of the zoning district or permit a use that's otherwise permitted. I think Mr. Barrett said we already met that, at least partially. The deck to the east side of Lot 5, putting that up doesn't impair vision on the streets, doesn't create a hazard of any sort, and it eliminates a safety issue. And the safety issue is obviously if somebody steps out that second floor window, they're going to get hurt. If somebody steps out the first floor window, they could get hurt. They just probably won't get hurt. I mean, first floor exit, they just won't be hurt as bad. There's not as far to fall. Same is true of the decks over on Lot 4. You don't get those things rebuilt, you've got serious safety hazard to the units of those, or the owners of those units. Number 6, the variance if granted does not adversely affect health, safety, and welfare. I have a hard time seeing how the decks on the end of, or the east end of Lot 5, creating kind of health, safety, or welfare issue for the rest of the community, and indeed, granting the variance eliminates the safety issue. The decks on the south end of Lot 4 that are in proximity to the carport, I understand that there's a proximity issue there. I can only point out a few things. One, if we don't replace them, we have a serious, obvious, immediate safety issue for the people who don't have those decks to step out on. 2, as Mr. Barrett pointed out, these are very bare-bones carports. There's no electrical in these carports. The association does not allow storage of anything but vehicles there, no combustibles, nothing like that. The association has a rule that prohibits not just the storage, but even having any kind of open flame barbecues on the lot. They cannot be, in fact, we passed that last year or the year before. We can have electric grills, that's it. In other words, what I'm trying to drive at here is if this is a fire safety issue, you haven't got a significant risk with the type of structure that's there, so that if you are a little closer than 10 feet to it, you're closer to a fairly minimal risk in the first place as up against the risk imposed or suggested by not having those decks in place.
Okay. This time, sir, I think we gave you an extra 4.5 minutes, but you may get some questions, so don't leave, and then you may be able to address some other issues under questioning, okay? Are there any questions for Mr. Cofield? Yes, Mr. Big.
Mr. Cofield, could you explain what the size of the decks are? I apologize if I couldn't find it in there.
I don't know the exact dimensions of the deck. Our contractor's here and can probably address that question in a couple of minutes. He could either do it now or if he can come forward after I'm finished. If I had to give you a guess, I'd say maybe 9 or 10 feet wide and 5 feet off the building. That'd be my best guess.
If he's here, I'd appreciate hearing from him at some point.
As far as the...
Hold on 1 second, if you could just state your name for the record.
You bet. My name is Russell Peterson, representing Alaska Tree Line. And to answer the question, those decks are out 5 feet, and they are built anywhere from 9.5 feet across, as far as the width dimension across the building.
And they project out 5 feet from the building then?
That is correct.
Okay,
to my knowledge, that is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Cofield? Yes, Mr. Freitas.
Yes, Mr. Cofield, you mentioned the decks were built originally with the building 30 years ago, but you stated, I think on 2 occasions, that the carports were 20 years old.
28.
28.
The carports were put in 2 years after the building was completed.
Who put the carports in?
My understanding is that the builder who built the buildings also put the carports in, that the units in the buildings weren't actually being sold until some time frame, maybe 2 or 3 months before the carports were complete. I can't absolutely swear to that, but that appears to be the case based on what we've been able to dig up.
Thank you.
Ms. Crop, do you have a question?
I did. You said that there was no storage in the carports. It did look from some of the pictures as if there were storage on the ends of the carport.
Okay, I said the association doesn't allow anything to be stored under the carports other than a car. There are small storage closets, 1 per unit, 4 on each end of the carport. The association rules don't allow any combustibles to be stored there. Not too many people actually use them. They're not terribly secure. I mean, it's a piece of T111 that somebody can just sort of bend away and reach in and take things out. The people who are using them, I have Christmas decorations in mine. I know somebody else has, their summer tires they stick in them. Most people don't even do that because people steal them. They're just not secure storage bins. They're relatively small, by the way. If I went from here to the end of the table, that would be about the size they are.
Thank you.
Any other board members with questions for Mr. Cofield? Yes, Mr. Big.
Yes, one further question. In the 2 units that we're talking about tonight, if I understand it correctly, every one of the units in each of the 2 buildings has a deck. Is that
every single one? Every unit in the entire association has a deck.
And that's true of all the other units
yes.
as well? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Barrett, do you have any questions for Mr. Cofield? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Cofield, just for a point of emphasis, one of the fire department's concerns was the use of charcoal or propane grills on the decks. I believe you were saying that's forbidden by association rules?
It's not only forbidden to use them, it's forbidden to have them on the property.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Is that a current request, Mr. Vega, or an older one? Okay. All right. With this, we will open it up for public testimony. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, yes.
I've got a question in terms of public testimony. We've got quite a few people here tonight. Are the property owners, are they considered part of the petitioner's body? And if so, are they allowed to testify here, or is this strictly related to people that don't have an ownership in the property?
It's a good question. I suppose technically owners of the units who are members of the association are really identified with the applicant, the petitioner, because they have the same ownership interests. So what Mr. Burkhart has raised, I think, is a fair issue. Is there anybody here who doesn't own a unit that would like to testify? Please come forward.
My name is Gordon Hazel. I am the registered agent for the Pioneer Estates Condo Association. Technically, I'm not an owner, but I don't have a vested interest in the property. I do want to address basically one issue. When this first came to light, is this too close? Even closer? Okay. Once this came to light, I went in and talked to the planning department, and then went over and talked to one of the fire inspectors, Frank Carpenter. Showed him the as-built, the photographs that were taken, which are in your packet, and discussed their concerns about this. According to Mr. Carpenter, they would not have a problem with the fire issue. He did say it was not a compliance, and he started citing many properties around town and many areas of town that were not in compliance and were in far worse condition than this. Unfortunately, Mr. Carpenter's out of town in Minnesota at this time, so I don't know why the fire department didn't address this in their letters in their packet. And another issue I'd like to address is that it would have a negative impact by not allowing these decks to be built, because all the properties, and if you notice in the photographs, that the adjoining condominium associations, very similar buildings, almost identical, all have decks and carports very similar to this property. That's it.
Are there any questions from the board members? Seeing none, the next public member, please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. For the record, my name is Bill Wilkowski. I'm the state senator, and I represent the members that are here tonight, the homeowners. I live close to this area. I've lived about 2 blocks away. Now I live a little bit further away. For about 10 years, the decks have been there, and all the time that I've been there. I'm here to testify in support of these variances, and I'm here because of one fundamental reason. And I think there's one fundamental issue that I think you need to look at in particular. Do the citizens in this municipality and in this state have the right to rely on permits that are issued by this municipality? I think they clearly do. Now, these structures have been in existence for over 28 years. The carports have been in existence for 28 years. These decks have been there for 28 years. These people bought these houses, these condos. There was no one had ever told them of any problems. The municipality had to issue a CO in order for these decks to be built. They did that. The municipality had to issue, came out, surveyed the property when the carports were built, issued permits when the carports were built, had to do a physical inspection when the carports were built. If there was a problem, they should have addressed this 28 years ago. It's unfair to these people to now, 30 years later, say, we made a mistake 30 years ago, sorry, we're not going to let you build your decks. We're going to let you leave gaping holes on the sides of your condos and because of a mistake that we made 30 years ago. I think that's mandatory. I think that's manifestly unfair to these people. So I can get into details. I've been out to the property with some of the homeowners. I've looked at the property. There's 54 decks total. 50 of them have been replaced. And I can tell you there was a question asked by Board Member Freitas about other decks in the area. There are decks all over East Anchorage, I can tell you, that are out of compliance, and no one's doing anything about them. These people have done everything that's been asked of them, paid $3,500, $3,500 for these variances. It's a lot of money for this small little condo association. And I would ask that you approve these variances, because I think the people of this municipality, the people of this state, have a right to rely on permits that were issued by this municipality 30 years ago. No one's ever complained. There's never been a safety issue. There's never been a fire. There's never been any problems at all with these decks. So I would ask that you issue a word of variance for all 3 of these. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Hang on a minute to see if anybody has some questions for Mr. Willikowski. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Other public testimony, here we come.
I'm not certain, my name is Min Young. I'm not certain if I would be considered having a ownership interest. I'm actually a tenant in one of the units, specifically in the units that doesn't have a deck. I've been there for, I think, about 9 years now. The entire time I've been there, I've had the deck, I've had the carport. What I have now is basically large planks of wood blocking off my sliding glass door that used to go out to the deck, which is no longer there. I'm not able to open the door, so if there were an emergency, the only exit I have out of my apartment is the front door, or trying to find a way to get out of the windows and somehow get onto the ground from the second floor. With the deck, when it was out there, I did have the ability to climb over the edge of the deck, get onto the lower deck, and hopefully make my way down without breaking both legs or doing some serious damage. I guess my position is we've always had the decks there, at least as long as I've been there. It doesn't make sense to have the decks now removed and then not to be able to put it back, especially if, as they're saying, it's the same dimensions and it's the same footprint that's been there the entire time. All the other units have their decks. In fact, they're now painting the other decks. And I'm still there with a sliding glass door that's blocked, especially in this hot weather that I'm not able to, open, utilize. And I understand the safety reasons for having it blocked, but it's a definite impact on my use of the apartment. And, I'm not sure of what else I can say other than that.
Okay, well, thank you. Are there any questions for Ms. Young? I don't see any.
Thank you.
Thank you. We got a couple more here.
Mr. Chairman, again, for the record, my name is Russell Peterson. I am representing Alaska Treeline. I'd like to speak on behalf of the not self-imposed of the actual committee. Alaska Treeline has actually made a mistake and demolished these decks without the direction of the actual association. Because of this mistake, they had no choice. They have no decks now at this time. I would like, on our behalf, just to give them what we are there to do and to get these decks back for them. As well as being with Alaska Treeline, I've been a builder for well over 15 years. And the building practices of the generations that come through are always continuously changing and improving for the better of the community. However, unfortunately, back 30 plus years ago, the building practices are not the same as they are today, and because of that, things were not necessarily overlooked. They were just not as carefully sought after. The change order process in the municipality right now is incredible. You go in and you have a specific change order that you do. To my knowledge, this change order was actually not in effect, so the actual permitting process of these decks didn't take into consideration what we are talking about here. They were absolutely built, at the time of this building. There was no way that they could have been built after the fact. These units weren't even sold or even lived in before, and the picture that's actually provided at this time, I just would like to ask the committee to please, take into them considerations that this is not their fault that they even have to rebuild them. So it is definitely the mistake of Alaska Treeline. Thank you.
Hang on a second. Are there any questions? I do have one question for you. When you did the demo work, it looks from the pictures that the cantilever joists are coming from interior. This was not done on the outside of the structure, was it?
That is correct. It's going all the way back to the bearing joist, all the way back into the interior.
Okay, and that would suggest it was done with the original construction, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Technically speaking, if you're an owner, we've already heard from you through your representatives. So our hands are tied in that regard. Are there any other members of the public who are not owners of the units who would like to speak? Seeing none, that will close our public testimony. The staff, through the municipality, Mr. Barrett, has a chance to address any of the issues that were raised.
No, thank you. I'm done.
Okay, thank you, sir. Oh, yes.
Would a question of Mr. Barrett be in order at this time?
Sure.
Mr. Barrett, being a relatively new member of this board, is it customary for the fire department or their inspectors to offer their comments verbally in the way that they did in this case, or is it more typical that they would be written down? Or I'm struggling to grasp the magnitude of that concern, and I wondered about that.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vig, without reflecting negatively on the fire department and the plans reviewers in fire, I find I often have to go after them for comments, whether verbal or written. In this case, the gentleman that Mr. Cofield spoke with, Frank Carpenter, is the regular plans reviewer, and he's been out of town for quite some time. And I spoke with the acting deputy fire chief at the time, so it's not likely we might have heard two slightly different things. But in direct answer to the question, if I insist they'll give me something in writing, I perhaps didn't insist strongly enough and just relied on a conversation with them.
Okay. Mr. Barrett, I actually have a quick question along those same lines. Based on your experience of doing this in your discussions with the fire department, wouldn't it also potentially pose a risk not to rebuild those decks, not to have egress from the second floor out there in case there was a fire?
Mr. Chairman, on some of the units where it might be possible to climb down from the upper story deck to the lower story deck, certainly that would make sense, but based on some of the photographs, I'm not sure I would recommend that for most people. If you look at the applicant's photographs on page 51, unless it were absolutely a case of being burned alive, would I recommend someone try to climb down from the upper story to the lower story deck on any of those. So I'm not sure that's what the intent of those decks is. Now, having said that, certainly if you've got sliding glass doors, you want them leading out to something. You don't want children or someone who is not familiar with the property inadvertently opening a sliding glass door that doesn't lead anywhere. That's a safety hazard, definitely.
Okay. Thank you, sir. With that, the matter is now closed and rests with the board. The board.
Excuse me.
Yes.
That the petitioner does have the opportunity for rebuttal, closing comments after the public hearing.
Does the petitioner, Mr. Cofield, would you like to say anything before we adjudicate on this?
Just two things. On page 51 that Mr. Barrett just referred to, I do want to point out that only the top two photographs are photographs from our association property. The bottom two are photographs of Foothills Condo Association further down Northview from us. The only other thing that I would like to say, and I had actually hoped one of our members could talk about this, one of our other board members took the time to walk around and talk to some of our neighbors that aren't part of the association, and the comments she kept getting back is either, we don't care, they've been there forever, or please put those decks back. It's just ugly to look at it the way it is. And for what it's worth, I wanted to get that in front of the board.
Thank you, sir. Any questions for Mr. Cofield? Thank you. Seeing none, now the matter rests with the board. We will require a motion in the affirmative and a second. Somebody? There we go. All right, Mr. Vig has moved to approve it. Do we have a second? Thank you, Mr. Burkhardt. Mr. Vig, you have the floor.
Okay. In the matter of case number 2009-091, I move to grant a variance, and I believe we need to split these into three. Is that correct? A variance for Lot 4 from AMC 2145.030, which requires a 10-foot separation between primary and accessory structures to allow carports and apartment buildings to be less than 10 feet apart. And for Lot 5, the similar request for variance from AMC 2145.030. Can we cover these with a single motion, or do they need to be broken out individually?
Mr. Chairman, I had only mentioned that they be addressed separately. If it looked like some might be denied and some might be approved, if the board's comfortable doing all three with one, that's fine.
It's your call, but I think we can proceed with all three on one.
Okay.
It's okay.
So I'll back up and just go for lots 4 and 5 then from AMC 2145.030, which requires a 10-foot separation between primary and accessory structures to allow carports and apartment buildings to be less than 10 feet apart. And Lot 5 from AMC 21.40.045, which requires a 20-foot front yard setback to allow reconstruction of a deck, which will encroach up to 3 feet into the 20-foot setback, subject to conditions identified by staff on page 10 of the packet.
Very good. Thank you, sir. It's been seconded by Mr. Burkhardt. You have the floor to speak towards your motion.
Thank you. This was a challenging one for me to dissect, but with regard to standard number 1, extraordinary physical circumstances, which I believe, because of the shape and just physical constraints of the properties, in some ways are some physical circumstances that need to be addressed, and so I would contend that those rise to the level of being partially met with regard to standard number 1. Standard number 2, the physical circumstances that are such that strict application would create exceptional or undue hardship. I believe that is substantially met for both lots, in that to deny the variance or strict application of the code would either require a deck of such size that would be too small to be usable, or deny the occupants secondary access from the deck in case of emergency. And I think that is an exceptional or undue hardship. I believe that standard number 3, the hardship is not self-imposed. I think the applicant presented some pretty compelling photographic evidence here that shows that the decks were in place at the time that the buildings were constructed, and that the carports followed fairly shortly afterward, and were done by the builder of the property back then, and it was permitted by the municipality. Standard number 4, that the variance if granted will not adversely affect the use of adjacent property. I believe that standard is substantially met. I don't believe it's a threat to or injurious to neighborhood or detrimental to public welfare. Had the well, I'll just leave it at that. Standard number 5, the variance if granted is in keeping with the intent of this code will not change the character of the zoning district. I believe that that's substantially met. It seems as though the character of the district is many condominium units such as these with similar decks and carports in similar fashions, so I don't think that this would change anything. The variance if granted in standard number 6 would not adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the people of the municipality of Anchorage. I was struggling the most with this one because of the comments noted in the packet from the fire department, but it seems as though that their comments or concerns weren't of sufficient concern to write them down or explain them in more detail that were forcefully made that I think would speak to that issue. So for that reason, I think I need to contend that that standard is substantially met. And with regard to standard number 7, that variance would be the minimum possible to make reasonable use of the land, I think that is substantially met. That these decks are 5 feet wide. Anything narrower would be either unusable or still of such a width that it would result in a variance request in any case. So I think this is basically the minimum variance that would be needed, and I intend to support the motion.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Burkhart?
In addition to Mr. Vig's comments, I'd like to add a few of my own. I think standard number 1 is particularly met in regards to the deck on the east side of Lot 5, in that the lot is unusually shaped, and the determination of primary front yard setback and secondary front yard setback is a rather subjective determination. It's based on the prevailing yard pattern, so it's really based on all the other lots except the subject lot, and given a different interpretation for that primary front yard. If that was a secondary front yard, the setback would only be 10 feet, and there wouldn't be any reason for a variance there. So I think that adds some credence to that being met. I agree with standard 2 with staff that that standard is at least partially met for both lots. And I guess my final comment is in relation to standard number 3. And I think according to the hardship not being self-imposed, I'm looking at Title 21 in Section 21.55.060, which have to do with repairs and maintenance of non-conforming uses of structures, and I'll read a bit of that. On any non-conforming structure or portion of a structure containing a non-conforming use, work may be done in any period of 12 consecutive months on ordinary repairs or on repair or replacement of non-bearing walls, fixtures, wiring, or plumbing to the extent not exceeding 10% of the current replacement cost of the non-conforming structure or non-conforming portion of the structure, as the case may be. Nothing in this chapter shall be deemed to prevent the strengthening or restoring to a safe condition of any building or part thereof declared to be unsafe by any official charged with protecting the public safety upon order of such official. And I think the intent there is that even non-conforming uses are allowed to be maintained and repaired. When you look at the cost of a deck, you can't replace 10% of that if all the total cost of the deck is for the structural support and the guardrails that are required by code. And so I take that if the association had approached the building department, they possibly could have declared those as unsafe and could be replaced. In any event, that this zoning issue and variance might have come to the fore in any event, but I think clearly those wood-framed elements suffer the effects of time and need to be replaced periodically. And I think the intent of Title 21 is allow for those elements to be replaced, and in that respect, I think Standard 3 is met. So I agree that this is a complicated case, involves public safety, the safety of the owners and the tenants of these units. But like Mr. Vig, I think on balance, I think the 7 standards are substantially met, so I'll be voting in favor of the variance.
Thank you. Ms. Croft.
I just wanted to make a comment about Standard 6, about the variance not adversely affecting the health, safety, and welfare. I do believe that because these are sort of the smallest carports you can have, that does make a difference in my mind about it not being a danger to the principal structures on the property. And the fact that there are no open flame barbecues on the deck was significant and important, I think, to guarantee that we don't have that kind of a transfer between the structures. And I believe they will police that well, because if you see their Board of Directors meeting minutes, they were very good about saying this is wrong in this unit, we need to clean that up. And so I think that they do enforce the rules they've set for the association. I think that's important in my confidence that would be upheld.
Thank you, Mr. Ron.
Ms. Croft actually covered the majority of my comments. I intend to support the motion as well, and would also like to commend the association for being proactive in addressing any potential concern, not only maintaining existing protections of human health, but also looking forward and instituting what you have. So, thank you.
All right. Mr. Freitas.
Yes, as Ms. Croft mentioned on Standard 6, I think also it's worth pointing out that the tenants and the owners are also people of the municipality of Anchorage, and by not granting this variance, I believe we're putting them in jeopardy and causing a safety and health issue by not allowing the decks to be rebuilt, and I think we need to consider that. Also, as a comment, I feel that this is something that really should have, and I understand staff has limitations and couldn't with the rules as they are, but this is something that really belongs as an administrative issue when something was permitted, COs issued, and a builder was allowed to sell these units as completed. Maybe we need to address something in the change in the title that this type of situation can be handled administratively, because I feel it should. I don't think that owners and residents of the community should be harmed because of something happened 30 years ago by someone else when it was in fact approved. I understand that the city is not responsible for errors on approvals, and there's some gotchas in there, but I think we need to address that somehow to prevent this sort of issue from happening in the future.
Thank you, sir.
I do intend to support the motion.
Okay. I would just point out that I, too, intend to support the motion, and I want to go on the record, though, however, and point out that I disagree with the description in the packet on page 6 and 7. I think Mr. Barrett may be technically right that there was no permit for the deck. On the other hand, there was a permit for the buildings, and it was inspected. And this was this was done when it was framed. And I don't think it's the description there actually matches the reality when it says that the decks were added without building permits, because I would think that they were built in with the building and were not added later, which is sort of how this reads. But I understand from Mr. Barrett's perspective why they would look at it that way if it wasn't part of the original plan, maybe adding it to the plan, but it certainly wasn't added in the sense after the building was built. So I think Mr. Cofield demonstrated that pretty well with the photographs and with Alaska Tree Line's testimony onto the actual structure itself. And there's also kind of a bit of an echo here with the issue that Mr. Freitas was just discussing, and I think Mr. Wilikowski pointed out, and that is, so it's kind of an estoppel here. And we dealt with this in the Spinelli coffee cart, if you remember. That was kind of fun. But sometimes when building permits are issued and the certificate of occupancies are given and everyone has gone on with their life and time has passed, that there's an element where it becomes simply unfair to say, we're not going to allow you to continue to do it. And I think that's some of what we heard tonight. And for that reason, I intend to vote for it. If there's no other testimony, we are closed on this matter, and we'll take a vote. The votes are in, and it appears this motion has passed unanimously. So, you bet. I do have to let you know if somebody could object and protest, they have 30 days after the final written decision is issued to do so. Other than that, you've got your progress to go forward with. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we are done with all matters before us. I don't know if we have any reports that anybody has. No reports? No board member comments? I think this meeting's adjourned then. Thank you, guys. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Barrett.
Thank you. Sorry, I should have jumped in sooner. There's a handout item for the administrative variance proposal changes. I'd hoped we'd be able to talk about it, but the deadline for having things on this month's meeting, the legal advertising deadline, was the day after last month's meeting, so I didn't make the deadline. So this is the final form that we have it in the AM and the AO for the admin variance changes. Just informational for you now. We'll have a workshop, if I can clear it with the boss, at the August meeting next month. And we'd come, I don't think we'll need a full hour, but if everyone could come or think about coming at around 6 in the evening, and we'll have food. And I'll follow all this up with email just to make sure the boss says okay. And then we would have a public hearing on it in September. So you want pizza or sandwiches if the boss says okay? Pizza?
Yes.
Pizza.
Yeah. Pizza it is.
He wants both.
Well, let me think. Okay, that was it. Thank you.
All right. We are adjourned. Thank you. Best I could do without it. Usually there's a crib sheet, it tells I think so.
I guess I like the way that they describe